IWA's 34, residing in New York City and employed on the night shift at View Hospital's intensive care unit. It wasn't my ideal occupation, but it covered expenses, and I had adapted to the peculiar quietude of the hospital during the night. Something about the way the subdued illumination created elongated shadows, how the ventilators droned in a hushed cadence. It seemed as if the building itself was respiring. I had, of course, encountered narratives. Every nurse had. Ancient hospitals accumulate more than mere dust and recollections. Some assert they retain entities, things that are out of place. I never subscribed to all that, at least not until I was designated to room 509. The occupant of 509 was named Joseph Halloway, a 43-year-old male who had been comatose for 3 months subsequent to a grave incident. He had no relatives, no callers, only apparatuses sustaining his life. I had no cause to be apprehensive, but the instant I entered his room, something felt amiss. The atmosphere was markedly cooler, and the scent, hospitals invariably smelled sterile, like a purifying agent. But here it was distinct, akin to moist soil. I dismissed it, assuring myself I was conjuring things. I examined Joseph's vital signs, modified his intravenous drip, and was preparing to depart when I detected it, a murmur. It was subtle, almost obscured by the monitoring device's beeps, but I perceived it, a delicate, fragmented mumble. My initial assumption was that someone was positioned behind me, but upon turning, the room was vacant. I gulped audibly and scrutinized Joseph's countenance. His eyes remained shut, his demeanor unaltered, but his lips were marginally separated. I inclined closer, scarcely breathing, and then I discerned it again, a whisper emanating from his mouth. I recoiled so abruptly, I nearly toppled the bedside stand. Comatose individuals don't whisper. Perhaps it was an unprompted sound, I rationalized. The psyche fabricates illusions, particularly during extended nocturnal shifts. I convinced myself it was insignificant. I had to. But then, as I approached the doorway, I perceived something that chilled me. A soft, muffled laugh. I didn't disclose it to anyone. What was I to communicate? That a comatose man derided me? I compelled myself to proceed, attributing it to fatigue, yet I dreaded my subsequent shift. 2 evenings later, I was reassigned to room 509. My stomach churned as I lingered outside the door, but I had a responsibility. I entered anticipating something to be altered, but everything was identical. Same equipment, same auditory signals, same frigid air. I maintained my distance while verifying his vitals, my auditory senses straining for any noise. Silence. Perhaps I had hallucinated the entire episode. Maybe. Please assist me. The vocalization was scarcely more than an exhalation, yet it originated from Joseph. I congealed. My intellect raced through clinical elucidations, involuntary vocalizations, cerebral activity oscillations, but none alleviated my mounting terror. I mustered the courage to vocalize Joseph? My own voice sounded alien, too diminutive for the chamber. No reply. I extended for the summoning device to notify a physician, but the instant I contacted it, his hand spasmed. Not a minor, reflexive twitch, but a clutch. I retracted my arm, my cardiac muscle pounding. Joseph's digits relaxed, and momentarily, I believed it was concluded. Then his head rotated just marginally toward me. I ought to have fled. Every primal urge implored me to depart, but I remained there, transfixed, as his lips shifted again. This time, the murmur was more distinct. He's approaching. I stumbled backward, my breath ensnared in my throat. Who was arriving? My rational intellect battled against the glacial dread ascending my vertebral column. Perhaps it was merely an arbitrary utterance, meaningless cerebral function, something explicable. But internally, I comprehended better. The room now felt dissimilar, as though something imperceptible had transposed. The atmosphere was denser, burdening my thoracic cavity. The overhead illumination flickered, not sufficiently to extinguish, but just adequately to cause my epidermis to tingle. My gaze darted to the monitor adjacent to Joseph's bed. His cardiac rhythm had escalated. Then the whispering recommenced. It wasn't emanating from Joseph this time. It was ubiquitous. The walls, the ceiling, the air ducts. It was as though the hospital itself was murmuring, superimposed vocalizations conversing over one another in subdued intonations. I couldn't decipher the phrases, but the acoustic phenomenon caused my stomach to constrict. I retreated toward the entrance, grappling for the handle, but it wouldn't yield. The mechanized lock was activated. My identification card should have unlocked it, but upon swiping it against the scanner, the display flickered. Error in crimson. Then Joseph mobilized again. His eyelids fluttered. I pressed myself, gazing vacantly, or perhaps it was the overwhelming chill in the chamber immediately preceding the monitor's silence. I couldn't dispel the disquiet. An hour later, as I ambulated past room 407, my breath congealed in my throat. The door was marginally ajar. The room had been vacated following Harold's remains being removed, but as I peered inside, I observed something that transformed my blood to ice. The cardiac monitor was beeping. I entered circumspectly, my pulse throbbing. The bed was unoccupied, but the apparatus exhibited a faint, irregular cardiac rhythm. The display flickered, glitching between flatline and a subtle pulsation. I retreated, experiencing a surge of queasiness. This wasn't feasible. Harold was deceased. I summoned Mark, endeavoring to sound judicious. Perhaps it's merely a monitor dysfunction, he suggested, manipulating the wires. But as soon as he contacted it, the display transitioned to static. The apparatus emitted a keen, ear-splitting screech before lapsing into silence. We both simply stood there, incapable of elucidating what we had just witnessed. I pivoted to depart, but then the lavatory door within the chamber creaked open. The illumination inside was deactivated, but I could discern the nebulous silhouette of someone standing there. My stomach constricted. There was no one else designated to this room. It was supposed to be vacant. I murmured, "Salutations?" The figure advanced. Mark yanked me backward just as the overhead illumination oscillated violently. We bolted from the chamber, securing the door behind us. We reported it to security, but upon their arrival, the room was precisely as it should be, unoccupied, silent, and tranquil. Mark and I remained mute as we ambulated back to the nurse's station. Neither of us desired to concede what we had perceived. Perhaps it was merely exhaustion, a deception of the subdued luminosity. But internally, we both comprehended something was amiss. At 4:12 a.m., the intercom crackled. A profound, static-infused voice murmured something unintelligible. It was emanating from room 407, the chamber that should have been vacant. My stomach clenched as I grasped the telephone to page security again, but before I could dial, the intercom whispered my appellation. It was subtle, scarcely perceptible, but I comprehended what I had discerned. "Nathan, return." My breath hitched. No one in the infirmary addressed me as Nathan. Everyone employed my surname. I hadn't heard my given name on duty in years. Mark perceived it too. His countenance was pallid, his hands quivering. That wasn't a malfunction. I declined to re-enter room 407, but the intercom persisted to hiss and murmur every few seconds, another static-drenched phrase. "Assist me. Still present, not concluded." I slammed the loudspeaker button, severing it, but the instant I did, every luminary in the corridor oscillated violently. Security materialized 10 minutes later, but by then, everything had normalized. The room was silent, the intercom defunct. They scoured the entire vicinity, but there was no one within, no indication of anyone breaching, nothing to elucidate what we had apprehended. I was prepared to depart prematurely, but then the mortuary contacted. You individuals relocated a patient down here earlier, correct?" The voice on the line sounded apprehensive. "Affirmative," I responded hesitantly. "Harold Grayson, room 407. The silence on the other end caused my epidermis to prickle. Then, finally, the mortuary attendant articulated, "We require your presence down here immediately." I exchanged an anxious glance with Mark before proceeding to the basement. I already comprehended what was amiss. Inside the mortuary, the attendant guided us to Harold's remains. He was still on the slab, shrouded in a white cloth. But the issue wasn't with his physique. It was with the cardiac monitor affixed to him. It was beeping. I fixated on the display, my blood congealing. A cardiac rhythm, faint, irregular, but undeniably present. Harold Grayson was exhibiting indications of vitality, but that was unfeasible. He had been deceased for over 2 hours. Mark stammered, this must be an error. But then beneath the cloth, I observed his digits twitch. The room was utterly silent, except for the faint, irregular beeping of the monitor. Mark and I stood transfixed, gazing at Harold Grayson's twitching hand beneath the cloth. The mortuary attendant retreated, muttering, That's not conceivable. Gradually I advanced, my pulse hammering in my auditory canals. I had witnessed his demise. I had verified his vital signs myself. He had been frigid, inanimate, and yet here he was, his digits curling marginally, as though endeavoring to clutch something imperceptible, or someone imperceptible. Mark murmured, We must examine. His voice was tremulous. Neither of us desired to execute it, but we had no alternative. I gulped audibly and extended with the video. If I exhibited it to my colleagues, they'd either deem I was manipulating them or, worse, believe me. I resolved to retain it to myself, at least for the nonce. But that didn't preclude me from feeling apprehensive each time I ambulated past room 409. The subsequent shift I ensured to inspect the chamber earlier in the evening. The bed was precisely where it should be, pressed against the wall, casters secured. I even affixed a diminutive fragment of tape on the floor adjacent to the leg, merely to ascertain if it would mobilize again. I proceeded with my rounds, endeavoring to disregard the sensation of being observed. At 2 a.m., I compelled myself to ambulate past 409. My breath hitched. The bed was in the center of the chamber again. The tape was torn as though something had hauled the bed directly through it. The atmosphere was frigid, and for the inaugural instance, I felt a peculiar pressure in my thoracic cavity, as though I wasn't supposed to be there. I wasn't the sole individual who discerned it. The janitor, an elderly gentleman named Louise, apprehended me gazing into the chamber. He shook his head. "Don't tamper with that bed," he mumbled. Upon my pressing him, he merely articulated, "Something in there dislikes being perturbed." That was all he would divulge. I commenced allocating attention to other phenomena, too. The monitor in that chamber, even when unplugged, would oscillate at peculiar intervals. The summoning button would illuminate haphazardly, even though no one was allocated to the chamber. The security cameras exhibited static whenever oriented at the bed, as though something didn't desire to be perceived. Then, one evening, I was solitary in the corridor when I discerned it. A low, stridulous resonance, gradual, deliberate. My physique turned rigid. I comprehended what I would perceive before I even pivoted my head. The bed was mobilizing, not merely displacing, but ambulating. It rolled steadily toward the doorway, halting just before traversing into the corridor. I don't comprehend what possessed me to execute it, but I advanced. My pulse hammered in my auditory canals. The bed was stationary now, utterly stationary, but the atmosphere encircling it felt charged, like standing adjacent to an operating generator. The instant I extended to contact the mattress, the entire bed lurched an inch toward me. I fled. I didn't approach room 409 for the remainder of the week, but on my final nocturnal shift preceding my days off, I committed an error. I became inquisitive. I desired to comprehend if there was a rationale underlying what was transpiring. Perhaps I was hallucinating things, perhaps not, but I had to verify. I inquired of one of the elder nurses, Maria, about the chamber. Her demeanor darkened. That chamber, she hesitated, lowering her voice. There was a patient there a few years prior. He was comatose, no callers, no relatives. One evening, his cardiac muscle simply ceased. The nurses hastened in, but upon their endeavoring to resuscitate him, something peculiar transpired. I inclined, my epidermis prickling. "What?" Maria gulped audibly. "The bed commenced mobilizing autonomously," she sighed. "Subsequent to that, the chamber was never the identical. Some assert he never departed. I don't approach it after dusk." That evening, I couldn't cease contemplating what she conveyed. I endeavored to disregard the attraction I felt toward room 409, but as I ambulated past, the door creaked open, gradually, deliberately. My throat constricted. The bed was, once more, in the center of the chamber, But this time, something was distinct. The bedclothes were compressed, as though someone was recumbent there. My hands quivered as I extended from my mobile device to capture an image. But before I could, the summoning button above the bed illuminated. A keen, rhythmic beep reverberated through the silent corridor. I retreated, my cardiac muscle pounding. The atmosphere turned glacial. Then, as if an imperceptible force had been anticipating, the bed lurched toward me. The casters stridulated, the bed mobilizing so rapidly it nearly impacted the wall. I didn't linger, I pivoted and fled. I informed my supervisor I declined to execute rounds adjacent to room 409 any longer. I never disclosed why, but I believe they already comprehended. A week later, I apprehended the hospital, finally extracting the bed from the chamber. No one would articulate why, but I possessed a premonition they encountered something too. Since then, I can't ambulate past a vacant hospital bed without feeling apprehensive. Occasionally, when I'm solitary in the corridors, I still discern the faint resonance of casters stridulating against the floor, and I avow, irrespective of my location in the edifice, room 409's door is invariably just marginally ajar. I was 36 when this occurred. I had recently relocated to Oklahoma City for a novel occupation as a nocturnal nurse in an ICU. The labor was debilitating, but I didn't mind, until one particular evening altered everything. It was late October, and the hospital corridors felt more deserted than customary. Something about that evening felt amiss. The atmosphere was unusually frigid, and even though I was habituated to the uncanny quietude of nocturnal shifts, I couldn't dispel the sensation of being scrutinized. Initially, I attributed it to exhaustion. ICU wards invariably possessed a disquieting stillness, but this was distinct. The fluorescent luminaries flickered faintly, casting elongated shadows across the sterile floors. It commenced when I was executing my rounds, verifying on patients. Room 306 had been unoccupied for weeks following the final patient's expiration, yet upon my ambulating past, I observed something unfeasible, a silhouette of an individual standing adjacent to the bed. My cardiac muscles ceased as I instinctively pivoted back, but the chamber was vacant. I inhaled deeply, persuading myself it was a deception of the illumination. But as I pivoted away, I discerned it. A faint murmur, my appellation. It was so delicate, almost like a respiration, but I felt it crawl down my vertebral column. No one else was proximate. The nurse's station was at the distal end of the corridor. Endeavoring to dispel the burgeoning disquiet, I proceeded, but the murmurs didn't cease. Each time I ambulated past room 306, I discerned them. They weren't clamorous, but they were tenacious, like someone desperately endeavoring to solicit my attention. By 3 a.m., I was too unnerved to disregard it any longer. I resolved to inspect inside, merely to alleviate my paranoia. The chamber was vacant, precisely as it had been previously. The bed was neatly arranged, the monitors unplugged, and yet the sensation of someone being present was undeniable. I stood congealed in the doorway, my pulse hammering in my auditory canals. Then the bed mobilized. Not extensively, just a subtle displacement, as though someone had compressed down on it. I retreated, gripping the doorframe. There was no draft, no open fenestrations, no rationale for that to transpire. I extended for the luminary switch, but just as I did, the murmur arrived again. It was more clamorous this time, directly behind me. I spun around, anticipating to perceive someone standing there, but there was no one, merely the vacant corridor stretching ahead. A shiver descended my vertebral column as I swiftly shut the door and ambulated away. I informed myself it was merely exhaustion. Protracted shifts, diminutive slumber. Perhaps my psyche was fabricating illusions. But internally, I comprehended better. Something was in that chamber, and it comprehended my appellation. Around 4 a.m., I sat at the nurse's station, endeavoring to distract myself with paperwork. The other nurses were on hiatus, and I was solitary. That's when I observed it on the monitor displaying room surveillance. The feed from room 306 oscillated. Static washed over the display, and for a second, I believed I discerned motion. I inclined closer, fixating on the grainy image. There, directly at the foot of the bed, was a figure, pallid, motionless, facing away from the camera. My stomach clenched as I grasped the radio and summoned security. But before I could even conclude my utterance, the figure vanished. Security materialized a few minutes later, but there was nothing. Nothing in the chamber, no indications of forced entry, no footprints, nothing. They dismissed it as a camera glitch, but I wasn't persuaded. That bed had mobilized, and I had perceived something standing there. I didn't mention the murmurs or the manner in which the atmosphere in room 306 felt ponderous, almost asphyxiating. I didn't inform them how, when I ambulated past again, I observed the bedsheet subtly perturbed, like someone had just arisen. I merely nodded and feigned to believe their elucidation. By the time my shift concluded, I was depleted, but as I accumulated my possessions, I discerned it one final time. A murmur directly in my auditory canal, so proximate I felt the respiration on my epidermis. A solitary phrase. Linger. I pivoted sharply, but there was nothing there, merely the vacant ICU, silent except for the remote beeping of monitors. I departed the hospital that morning, but something informed me whatever was in room 306 wasn't concluded with me yet. I endeavored to expel the experience from my mind, persuading myself it was exhaustion. But even following my departing the hospital, I couldn't dispel the sensation that something was appended to me. That evening, as I reclined in bed, I avowed I discerned the identical murmur, delicate, remote, yet unmistakable. Linger. I sat up, my cardiac muscle pounding. My apartment was somber, the sole illumination emanating from the faint luminescence of the streetlight outside. I retained my respiration, listening. Nothing, merely silence. Still, I couldn't dispel the disquiet that ascended my vertebral column. It felt like something was in the chamber with me, observing. Slumber didn't arrive readily that evening. Each time I occluded my eyes, I perceived that vacant hospital bed, the subtle indentation on the mattress, the nebulous figure on the monitor. I kept jolting awake, certain I'd discerned a resonance. Footfalls, respiration, something mobilizing just beyond sight. The subsequent evening at work, I circumvented room 306. I concentrated on my assignments, adhering close to the nurse's station and feigning nothing was amiss. But around 2 a.m., an alert sounded. A motion detector in room 306 had been activated. I fixated on the monitor, my breath catching in my throat. The camera feed was glitching, static oscillating across the display. And for a fleeting instant, I perceived it again. A figure standing in the precise, identical location at the foot of the bed. A frigid perspiration enveloped me as I grasped my radio. But before I could summon security, the display cleared. The bed was vacant, the chamber was tranquil, the motion alert ceased. I hesitated, every primal urge clamoring at me not to enter, but I had to. I had to demonstrate to myself that nothing was present.